10 years ago.
All right. Welcome. My name is Franz Kafka, and I'm a member of the Chicago YIVO Board of Directors. The Chicago YIVO Society is a local affiliate of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. The mission of Chicago YIVO is to entertain and educate the local community through subsidized lectures, such as today, music programs, and film screenings that reflect the rich heritage and the diversity of Jewish culture, and to ensure the future of Yiddish through language education. Please go to our website, chicagoyivo.org, for more information and to become a member or a donor. Your financial support helps us bring you programming such as we are today. Today on our program, we have Samuel Spinner, who is the assistant professor of Yiddish at Johns Hopkins University, where he researches and teaches Yiddish and German literature, Jewish art, and the Holocaust. His book, Jewish Primitivism, came out in 2021 with Stanford University Press and won the 2022 Book Prize of the Modern Language Association for Studies in Germanic Languages and Literatures. He is now researching a book on the role of monuments in Holocaust .
Okay. Okay, now I am unmuted. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to come to Chicago, if virtually, and speak with you this Sunday afternoon. I'm very excited to be sharing with you my book. I'm also very excited that I didn't mess up the time, what with the clock changes and with the ever elusive time difference between Chicago and the East Coast. So I'm extra excited to be here with all of you. I'm also excited to talk to you about my book. Usually I talk to fellow academics about my research, and that can get tiresome because fellow academics like to quibble about everything, but also because that's what I'm accustomed to. So I'm excited for the opportunity to talk to new people and different people about my research. But I'm also aware that I may at times lapse into academic lingo. So if I do that, or when I do that, and I say something that that's a little obscure or doesn't make any sense, please do ask me in the Q&A to explain myself. I'm going to try to present to you what my book is about, and here it is. And if you want your very own copy, it has pictures in it. You can order it from Stanford University Press, or I suppose wherever books are sold. I'm going to try to explain to you, tell you what my book is about by giving a very short overview at first, to just kind of introduce some of the issues and questions. And then to give you kind of condensed versions of the first chapter and the last chapter. So we're not getting a kind of whole trajectory here, the whole arc of the argument. You're getting two focused views of what I mean when I say Jewish primitivism. And so, I have no doubt that there will be lots of questions because I'm trying to condense a lot into a short presentation. And that's fine also, because when I wrote the book, I didn't intend for it to be absolutely all-encompassing of everything that could be defined as Jewish primitivism. I meant it to start a conversation, or open up a new chapter of a conversation about works of art and works of literature that for many of us avid Yiddishists are familiar, including some of the best-known stories by Yidlamed Peretz, among others, but also German literature, German Jewish literature that is quite well known, works by Kafka among them. To also bring into that conversation of works that we're all quite familiar with, or at least may have heard of, some other less common things, and to take a slightly different view on how we think of modern Yiddish and modern Jewish culture in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. And that slightly different view is what I call Jewish primitivism. And the idea is, and I'll kind of lay this out a little more formally in a few minutes, the idea is to connect it to that broader artistic movement called primitivism, but also to show what are the specifically Jewish questions, issues, and contexts that emerge from this shift in attention among Jewish writers and artists to the things that are kind of sweepingly and commonly called primitivism. I'd also like to flag at the outset that when I say the word primitive, you can always imagine me doing these scare quote bunny ear things. The idea that there is such a thing as a primitive culture or a primitive human being is one that, broadly speaking, we no longer accept and isn't anymore in use among scholars, because it developed in the 19th century in a way that was intended to promote racism and white supremacy. The idea of ethnographers and art historians talking about primitive culture was that European and white culture was better, and this was one way that they were going to prove it. So obviously that is not true, and not something that we accept, but it was something that was extremely widespread and that played a major role in the culture of the period. And so when I'm talking about what these figures were thinking and writing about primitive peoples, these are their words and their attitudes. And so the kind of presentation that I'm giving you is meant to show my sort of analytical and critical perspective of a point of view that they had, rather than my point of view itself. So again, when the word primitive comes up, imagine that I'm kind of using it at a critical reserve, but I'm not going to say so-called every single time. So now let's dive in. And let's start with Peretz. In a 1910 speech, Yud Lamed Peretz declared, quote, "Two paths lie before us. One path to Europe, where Jewish form will be destroyed. The second path back." So that's kind of dramatic. It's dramatic because Peretz in his essays liked to be dramatic, but it's also dramatic because it shows the stakes of how this problem was viewed. Europe is going to destroy Jewish form. What is Jewish form? He meant Jewish art and Jewish literature. He meant what makes this art and literature Jewish. And back is where you go to save it. Where is back? This is the answer he gave. He said in Yiddish, he gave these three words: Bibel, Chassidish, Volksstimmlichkeit. Bible, Hasidic, folklorism. So I'm going to explain what he means by this, but it's kind of confusing. There's an adjective, there's nouns. Bibel is kind of a strange word for something usually called teure. Why does he say that? So he's talking about directions, back. He says the second path goes back. Forward and backward were not his only directions. He also went up and down. Here's another quote. "Art is a staircase, and the ground floor is the primitive of the folk." Okay, so art is a staircase. You're going up to some kind of refinement, but where you start out, the basis, the foundation is the primitive of the folk. So Peretz's compass goes back and down, back to the folk and the past, down to the primitive. These are the cardinal points of primitivism. The here and now is not important. Back and down, you're trying to get at something. Here's another example. Franz Kafka. In a 1912 speech that Kafka gave about Yiddish, a very interesting and kind of weird speech. Kafka was very into Yiddish, although he never quite learned it. Here's what Kafka had to say about Yiddish. Quote, "Once Yiddish has taken hold of you and moved you, and Yiddish is everything, the words, the Hasidic melody, you will have forgotten your former reserve. Then you will come to feel the true unity of Yiddish." So, right, that's also a pretty dramatic statement where he's trying to emphasize a certain idea of Yiddish that is quite distant from a reality of Yiddish being just a language, which is a language like any other. Yiddish is special to Kafka. He says it's everything. Here's something else Kafka said, taking a kind of different point of view. In 1914, Kafka wrote in his diary, quote, "What do I have in common with Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself. I should stand quietly in a corner, happy that I can breathe," end quote. Right? So Kafka's saying here, like, forget it. What are you worrying about other people? Let me focus on myself, figure out the basics. You can't get much more basic than breathing. And then we can work on trying to figure out who I am. And after that, maybe I'll figure out who other people are, other Jews. Okay, so there's an idea that, like, let's not try to turn other people into this category of primitive or others. But he also did that. In 1915, he went to a Shalashidis, a Hasidic Shalashidis with a Rebbe in Prague. And here's what he said to his friend right afterwards on the way out. He said, if you look at it precisely, it was exactly like a savage African tribe, right? These are Hasidim, Jews, a savage African tribe. So in the first statement, when he says Yiddish takes a hold of you, he sees Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture more broadly as a really exciting rejection of the westernized Judaism that he saw among the bourgeois German-speaking Jewish milieu around him. In the second, when he says he should stand in the corner happy that he can breathe, he rejects the idea of looking at Jews as if you can get something from these exotic foreign Jews. Turn the lens on yourself. And in the last, he seems to be disparaging Hasidic Jews with a racist comparison to Africans. Pretty bad. What's going on there? So we'll kind of draw this all together and explain it. But right now I want to foreground these. These are all in their different ways examples of Jewish primitivism. Their agenda is the same agenda as what we call primitivism more broadly in European modern art and literature. And that was basically a critique of modern society and modern art that claimed that there was a better way of making art and a better way of living among people who were considered by Europeans to lack civilization. The people who Europeans considered to lack civilization were called, both colloquially and scientifically, ethnographers and academics call them this, they were called primitive. And these people were almost always colonial subjects living under the domination of European empires, and they were almost never white. The idea was, among this kind of primitivist way of looking at the world, that before humans were corrupted by modernity, before they were corrupted by any civilization at all, they were truly free. There was a time when you could be truly creative in prehistory, truly alive. So for civilized peoples, which is white Christian European peoples, they felt that they were the best. This time of freedom, creativity, and vitality, it ended before recorded history. It was gone. You could only look back towards it and imagine it. But around the end of the 19th century, European scientists, anthropologists, and artists following on these ideas believed that you could find such a state among so-called primitives, among the tribes, the native peoples who were being discovered by Europeans around Africa, the South Pacific, and other places around the world. And Europeans believed that these people were stuck in a permanent state of prehistory, unchanging, never changing. And so they reflected that prehistoric way of living. Europe, Christianity, civilization had history and progressed through thousands of years of history, but the so-called primitive peoples were just stuck in a prehistoric moment. And that made them a resource. Not only, obviously European empires wanted to use these people and their lands as resources for making money, European artists and thinkers felt that they were a resource for making new art. That was primitivism. Some very famous artists participated in this, Gauguin, Picasso, many others. My book is about how this phenomenon made a strange appearance in Jewish culture and was transferred, turning the so-called primitive object of analysis from far away to European Jews. So primitivism, and this is strange because primitivism usually looked at something that it defined as other. And since primitivism was initially European, that meant that the people who were kind of dragged into the roles of primitives were usually defined as everything Europeans claimed they were not. The so-called primitive was dark-skinned, was illiterate, was uncivilized, was superstitious, lacked logical reasoning capacities. They believed all of this, Europeans, about these people. So Jewish primitivism, which was by Jews and about Jews, this was not something that non-Jews did. This was a phenomenon of Jewish culture and art. It should have been impossible, or at least undesirable, because European Jews were often stereotyped, both by themselves, but more often by others, as too modern, too urban, too political, too literate, too involved in elite pursuits, and so on. And even if Hasidic Jews, who were often the subject of primitivism among Jews, even if Hasidic and other Eastern European Jews superficially resembled more distant so-called primitives, and it's not clear that they did, why would European Jews valorize and celebrate people who are actually among the most vulnerable and the most poor in Europe? Like, what sense did that make? Why at this sort of crucial moment of Jewish history in Europe, where emancipation had made certain legal rights and status finally attained, why did all of a sudden Jews turn to people who were kind of under the boot of the Russian Empire or in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the poorest by far region of the empire, and say, these Hasidic Jews, these Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews, these are our model for revitalizing Jewish culture. This wasn't only something that German Jews did. This was something that Yiddish-speaking Jews in these regions themselves did. How did that make sense? Neither Jews nor so-called primitive peoples were equals in modern civilized Europe. And of course, Jewish primitivists, these writers and artists like Peretz and Kafka, they weren't arguing for the exclusion or subjugation of Jews. They weren't arguing for turning these Jews into a colonial or economic resource. They were arguing, and Jewish primitivism, this phenomenon emerged from the effort to create Jewish identity and nationhood through culture. The idea that if the Jews wanted to finally be a nation on equal footing with other European nations, and this was with or without a nation state. So this is commonly called, or among the versions that this applies to, are not only Zionism, which advocated for a nation state, but cultural Zionism, which said that there's a value in a holistic Jewish identity even without a nation state, or the diasporic nationalism of Bundism, for example, which said something similar. We have a culture, it's here in Europe. We need to develop our nationhood without a nation state. All of these were varying ways of promoting what the recently arrived in Chicago Jewish historian and Yiddishist Ken Moss, in his first book, calls the Jewish Culture Project. That's a project of creating a national identity even without a nation state. Jewish primitivism came out of that. But European modernity, modern European art, thought, society, the whole thing, it depended on difference between the Jew and the Christian, between the European nation or the Volk, as it was called in German, and whoever was outside that, between the civilized and the primitive, binaries, inside and outside. And so imagining European Jews as primitive savages, European Jewish writers and artists blurred the border between savage and civilized. In other words, while primitivism more broadly was about difference, Jewish primitivism complicated that in a confusing but ultimately artistically productive way, because from the perspective of European art and society, Jews were plausibly European, right? They were kind of inside and outside. There was plenty of anti-Semitism, but there was also an awareness that Jews had been in Europe for as long as, European modern nations, that Yiddish was a form of a Germanic language. Even if it wasn't recognized as being equal, it was recognized as being European. They were plausibly European, but they were also plausibly primitive. Stereotypes that were very commonly held felt that European Jews were essentially like those peoples that anthropologists were discovering and studying around the world. So they were regarded kind of ambivalently as inside and outside European culture. Jewish primitivism, that is Jewish writers and artists adopting this point of view, they take that ambivalence and they ask to what degree Jewishness and Europeanness are really compatible if being European always meant excluding Jews to one degree or another. So there's this kind of push-pull dynamic, the way that this project emerges from a moment when Jewish writers and artists and thinkers are trying to find a place for Jews in Europe, at the same time recognizing that a pointed critique was necessary because Europe was ultimately not admitting either culturally or politically Jews in the way that Jews had hoped for. I want to emphasize that Jewish primitivism was not kind of a specific artistic movement, meaning there wasn't one set of styles. There's no list of bullet points of principles that you had to adhere to. I like to think of it as a project with a direction, back or down, as Peretz put it, but without a specific destination. Or maybe as a process, but without a specific method or a goal. This meant that it could be politically flexible. Throughout my book, you'll find examples of assimilationists and Zionists, revolutionaries and reactionaries. It meant that it was linguistically flexible. It was written and produced in Yiddish, in Hebrew, and in German. And it allowed for aesthetic and artistic flexibility. It was romantic, it was modernist, it was in literature, painting, graphic art, photography. It was about art, it was about folklore, it was realist, it was abstract. Any type of moment or phenomenon that you can find in modern culture, I'm arguing that Jewish primitivism was there. It was a way of looking at the relation between art and identity, between Jewish art and Jewish identity. That was so important in modern Jewish culture. So here's a quick pair of examples from my book before we get into some deeper a deeper look at Peretz and then a photographer. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so here you are looking at the German Jewish poet and artist Else Lasker-Schüler. Can you all see this? Okay, great. Else Lasker-Schüler was a very interesting character. There's a lot to say about her, but I'm not going to tell you much more about her today, but you can read, there's a chapter in my book about her. She was a very interesting character. She introduced herself if you would meet her on the street or in the cafe, and she signed her letters to friends as Prince Yusuf. This is what she called herself. If you called her Else or Frau Lasker-Schüler, she would get very upset. Prince Yusuf was the chief of the Society of Savage Jews. These were warriors who she imagined she was the chief of, but who were also throughout her art and her poetry. They were in illustrations of her books, in paintings, and they were described in novels and poems. Here's a picture that she wrote at the bottom in German, the Society of Savage Jews. And she's kind of mixing up real life and art in this invention. And the main thing here is that it's savage, it's primitive. This is the identity that she adopted for herself. She was a bohemian poet, and she claimed, although it's not quite true, that she wasn't interested in politics. But this idea of a sort of unfettered primitivism created a certain kind of strength for her that was emancipatory in a way, that made her independent of the actual position of Jews or of herself in Berlin in the first half of the 20th century. She was friends with, strangely, and here's another picture, the savage Jews, here the chieftains. You can see the way they look, kind of savage. One of them has a Magen David sort of tattooed or inscribed on the side of his head. There's a weird kind of like Pope hat or helmet in the middle there. Right? This is a very strange and aggressive, but poetic, ultimately poetic and artistic vision. She was friends with a poet, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who initially was a Yiddish poet and then moved to Palestine, became a right-wing Zionist, and wrote for the rest of his career in Hebrew. They were friends, a sort of odd couple friendship. And he turned this idea from sort of theoretically and artistically violent and powerful into an explicit vision of the society of savage Jews as being about the conquest of Palestine and the settlement of it by Zionists. So if you look, let me go back one slide. If you look closely in the center there, you can sort of see a semicircular shape. That's the dagger on the belt of Prince Yusuf. And the dagger has written on it the Hebrew letters Ve'ahavta, from noted central biblical passages, either from the Shema, Ve'ahavta, and you shall love the Lord with all your heart and soul and belongings, or also famously, love thy neighbor as thyself, right? But love, thou shalt love, inscribed on a dagger, right? That's kind of a weirdly ambivalent statement. Uri Tzvi Greenberg takes this and tries to keep it in the realm of poetry, but also bring it into the lived and enacted world of politics. Here is Greenberg standing with two other poets in their militia. They started a militia in when it was still Palestine. They identified themselves as fascists, and the idea was that they were going to, have a fascist militia to help create a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Fortunately, that was three writers and poets, so that their militia was not very effective. And they did one or two things, and I don't think anybody got hurt. And then Greenberg went on and just continued writing poetry for the rest of his career. But the idea was in part inspired by this notion of primitive identity, that you could take that dagger out of the poem and bring it into the real world. And it also had messianic overtones. Here's some hand lettering that Greenberg did himself for a poem he wrote about Shabtai Tzvi, the great messianic pretender, Shabtai Tzvi, who was for him not a sort of shameful and embarrassing moment in Jewish history, but an inspiration. This is about taking Jewish destiny in your hands. And you can see that this idea of a sort of primitive identity is there in the shaping of the letters. They're scribal, but the Jewish scribal art is refined and elegant. Greenberg shows it as if there's the sort of angry, childlike primitiveness to these letters. So in general, in the book, I talk about two main areas in which there's primitivist art and literature. There's identity, what does it mean to be a Jew? And there's aesthetics. What does it mean to make Jewish art or to write Jewish literature? Turning to primitivism was a way to escape from and a way to critique the political part of the urgent question of Jewish identity, the political part that dominated the landscape of Jewishness in the first half of the 20th century. Primitivism worked against the sort of creation of a national identity because it rejected the idea that there was any sort of stable or unified or unifying national or folk identity. It kept shifting, and if it keeps shifting, you can't make it cohere. Primitivism was also, and this is important, it was also an aesthetic and artistic project. By uncovering alternative artistic traditions, including, importantly, looking at Ashkenazic folk traditions, both of art, synagogue decoration, tombstone ornaments, and literature, predominantly Hasidic storytelling. Jewish primitivism probed the possibilities for creating Jewish art and literature beyond European traditions, 19th century European traditions. So in my remaining time, I'm going to show you the overarching trajectory of how this worked by sharing with you a little bit of the very first and very last chapters of my book. The first is about the centrally important and famous to us Yiddishists and friends of Yiddish, writer Yud Lamed Peretz, Y.L. Peretz, and the last about a less well-known photographer called Moshe Vorobeychik. With the discussion of Peretz, we'll see how some of these major concerns about Jewish identity were expressed as problems of Jewish culture, problems of art, and problems of literature, and how Peretz tried to think through it and tried to solve it, and how the solution was, in essence, Jewish primitivism. With the photographer Vorobeichik, we'll see how this problem was dealt with around 1930, around 30 years later, when the political and the artistic landscape had shifted quite a lot and significantly. Okay, so let's start with Peretz. So I quoted already that Peretz described art as a staircase. Oh, I'm getting ahead there. Don't look at that yet. I'll flag it when I read that. Peretz described art as a staircase. He said the primitive of the folk was the ground floor. And here's what you do, he said, when you find that primitive material. Quote, collect, make notes, transcribe, come together, learn to read, sing together, recite, enjoy yourselves, create the atmosphere for art. Genius will come later and create, end quote. Right, so he kicks the can down the road. Genius will come later and create. What genius would create, he didn't say. So that's not very helpful if you're, kind of issuing an artistic program. Here's what you need to do. We'll figure out the details later. But his own works offered an answer. Most prominently, he was prolific, but some of his best known works were central to his project. And I think that these offer a sense of the answer that he sort of implicitly proposed. And those are the two landmark volumes called Hasidic Stories, and Volkstümliche Geschichten, folkloric or folklore style stories. And from these two volumes are some of his most famous stories that you may have read or be familiar with. He began to publish these stories in around the 1890s, and they were collected as books in 1903 and 1906. And these are probably the best known examples in Yiddish of that aesthetic of folklore that was at the heart, that Peretz, in a way, brought, along with Ansky, to the heart of modern Jewish culture in that period. These works were intended to play a central role in a Jewish cultural renaissance that was part of the project of creating a national identity. Folklore wasn't just about anthropology or science, and it wasn't only about creating a nation. The place where the science and the national politics overlapped was in the literature and the literary creation of folklore. And that explains the importance, really the centrality of folklore as literature in the period. It wasn't only part of this very dominant Jewish political project. Its resonances made it a central part of the Jewish cultural project. And in a way, this is a paradox because the literature of Jewish nationalization, which was folklore, laid the groundwork for primitivism, which became a project that was at odds with nationalism, both politically and aesthetically. But it came from within, right? So you have a kind of push-pull dynamic, a paradoxical dynamic, if you will. You couldn't get to Jewish primitivism without Jewish folklore. And so Peretz himself, in his works, presents this problem and presents the sort of paradox of that push-pull dynamic. But it wasn't only Peretz. A lot of writers were using mostly Hasidic stories, but also in general Ashkenazic Yiddish folklore. Writers like Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, who wrote mostly in Hebrew, said that Hasidic literature should be the basis of modern Jewish art. We'll talk in a minute about Peretz, who wrote an entire collection of Hasidic-inspired stories. In German, famously, Martin Buber, a philosopher and writer, in 1906, right around when Berdichevsky and Peretz and everyone were doing this, 1906, Buber translated the stories of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav into Yiddish, and it became a bestseller in German and later in English. So these were, very much of the moment and in the mix culturally. But what did it mean? Why Hasidic literature at all? What did they think it would bring to modern European literature? Here's how Buber described it. Buber said, quote, "That which the Hasidim related remained raw ore, the most precious ore. I simply smelt it down into its pure narrative form." right? So you're digging it out of the earth, but it's raw and unformed. You have to purify it. This is a key idea of primitivism more broadly, that there's art, it has value, it is in essence, in its raw, rough state, as close as you can get to what you need, but you can't use it like that. You have to find a way to bring it into the modern world without corrupting it. You don't want to introduce any flaws into your pure ore. In the case of art, it would be you don't want to inject any modernity into it, but you have to do something to it to make it usable. What's that something? Here is how the famous Yiddish writer and anthropologist Ansky, who is himself a major figure in the story of Jewish primitivism, here's how he described Peretz doing it. So Ansky would go into the field. He organized the first Jewish ethnographic expedition. He was a big collector of folk tales and stories. And he transcribed the stories. He brought it back to Warsaw, where Peretz famously held court in a salon, everybody sitting around him. They used to, on Shabbos afternoon, sing Rebenu in the Rebenu about Peretz. All right, so Peretz was really the ringleader of this literary world. Ansky would come with his offerings of Hasidic stories, and here's what he said, quote, "While I was still telling the story, Peretz had already grasped it, assimilated it, and cast off the unartistic bits, added in new ones, and bound it all together with details from another story. And I had hardly finished when Peretz had already begun to tell me the same story, transformed into a folk tale, which was as far from the original version as a cut diamond from a just unearthed diamond in the rough. The next day, the story would already be written down, and a few days later published with a dedication to Ansky the collector." All right, so it's quite similar to Buber, that they're unearthing something from the earth, right? A mine, ore from the mine, or a diamond, and smelting it into something new or polishing it into something new. But there was a problem. And the problem was that by smelting the ore and polishing the diamonds, you ran the risk of eliminating what was special about these sources, and you just turned them into regular European art or chintzy-looking jewelry. Instead of being transformational, this was just mimicry. You had a diamond and you ended up with like a cubic zirconium or something. And just writing in Yiddish wasn't enough to solve the problem, as many people were proposing in the period. Here's how Peretz himself described the question in his 1910 essay, "Was fehlt in der Literatur?" What is our literature lacking? Quote, here's what Peretz says: "If you have nothing to say, you can speak Yiddish from cradle to grave and everywhere, at home, in the street, in the study house, during prayers, and at the Philharmonic. But what you say will be Goyish. And on top of that, it'll be banal, it'll be mimicry, it'll be dead." Wow. And this is because, as Peretz explains, mimicry inhibits intuition, and art is about intuition. He explained the point by making a comparison, critiquing what colonialism did to its subjects in Africa. All right, so here's where that sort of literal comparison of primitivism to the colonial subject comes in. This is from the same essay, more from Peretz. Quote, "African children who study in European schools show great ability in the early grades, as long as it is enough to hear what the teacher says and learn it by heart, to remember and repeat what it says in the book. For that, they're the best. In the 4th or 5th grades, stop. You need your own living intelligence. You need intuition, you need drive. And in a foreign school, the African child loses those things. He has studied and mimicked for so long that his own well has dried up. The process beneath consciousness, intuition, has stopped. And what emerges from school is a spiritual dwarf, spiritually depressed and impotent, dressed in the European fashion, frock coat, top hat, gloves, a European curtsy, but withered and empty. Our literature is also cursed by this dwarfness." By this stunted growth. All right, so that's a very dramatic and very strong statement. He's saying that colonialism destroys the indigenous peoples of Africa because it imposes a model of education on them that doesn't reflect their own needs and their own culture. And the same thing happens to Jews in Europe, and you can see it in Jewish European literature. It's an incredible statement. He kept hammering away at it. Here's one more example from a speech called Wegen der Jiddische Literatur on Jewish literature. Let me see if I have that quote here. Yeah, if Jewish literature wishes to be Jewish, it needs to be it in more than language, in the exterior form of the word. It needs to be Jewish in essence, in its soul. It must stop mimicking Europe. If we remain European copycats, creators of books just for entertainment, for ladies, we are in service of the very same assimilation we are fighting against. But instead of developing ourselves to let our own souls shine, we have become imitators. So the danger is mortal, right? This is destroying, Peretz says this is destroying European Jewish culture, but there's a way out. He has a way out. Here's what he says. We have two paths before us. And I already quoted this at the beginning. One leads to Europe, where Jewish form will be destroyed. The second path leads back to what was, to our past. And where do we find the past? Peretz goes on. In Jewish life, we find the folkloric, das Volksstimmliche, what the folk tells about itself, that's folk tales. Hasidic works, das Chassidische, and so on. If the Jewish poet would take these riches and work through them according to his own spirit, not European, if the Jewish musician would seek out and beautify the melodies of the folk, all will be well. We would have the beginnings of a Yiddish literature. What we aspire to can only be found in our Bible, in Chassidish, in folklore. But the choice of the word Bible as the Europeanized version of Torah is pretty weird, and it seems to be exactly the opposite of what Peretz is calling for and shows the problem that he's facing. It's a Christian, or maybe at best a secular word, and it shows the paradox. Peretz sought authenticity, not through mimicry of authentic sources, but in a modern European manner. Right? He couldn't help but say Bibel instead of Torah, even though what he's calling would seem to say you have to go to Torah. And in this essay, he consciously and without irony holds up his own works as a model for this kind of art. He introduced the passage I just quoted by saying, I am talking about myself. Okay, so despite the fact that they are broadly European, Peretz felt that his own works were the best example of how to restore Jewishness to contemporary Jewish culture. So did Peretz pull it off? Meaning, in his essays, we can see what is a primitivist critique of European art and modern Jewish European art. It's disconnected, it's mimicry. You need to get back and down to that originary intuition. That's in his essays. But Peretz, of course, is famous for his fiction. Did he pull it off? So I don't think so, and neither did many of his contemporaries. For me, what makes Peretz so interesting is this sort of central paradox or contradiction in his work. In the essays and the speeches, he denounces exactly the kind of thing he ends up writing in his fiction. A quick and good example of this, I think, is his what might be his most famous story, Ob nicht noch hecher, if not higher, from 1900, which was published in the Chassidish collection. So the story's narration is marked by a kind of folklorishness, folksiness, which seems to fit. It presents itself as a Hasidic tale. But on the other hand, the narrator is not a Chassid, but is a skeptic of Hasidism. This skeptic has come to the shtetl to test the truth of a story the Hasidim of the local Rebbe tell. Every morning they say at the time of the pre-dawn slichas, penitential prayers that precede Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe ascends to heaven to intercede directly with God on behalf of his people. The skeptic is a Litvak, a Lithuanian Jew, cold-hearted and rational, ultra-rational in the stereotype, immune to the magic, to the mysticism of Hasidism. So to find out what's going on, this Litvak comes to town and he hides under the Rebbe's bed to see where he goes every morning. And what he sees is the Rebbe getting up, dressing up as a non-Jewish peasant, chopping wood in the forest, and delivering the wood to an impoverished, sick woman who has no money to heat her home. And he gives it to her at no charge. The story ends as follows, quote, later, whenever a chassid would tell how the Rebbe gets up early every morning during the high holiday season and goes up to heaven, the Litvak would not laugh, but quietly agree, if not higher, end quote. So it's quite beautiful. The skeptic has been convinced of the Rebbe's holiness and he's become a chassid. But he's not really a chassid. He doesn't look at the Rebbe's deed in the same way the actual chassidim do, in a religious, indeed in a sort of mystical framework, ascending literally to heaven. Instead, he sees the Rebbe's holiness in the universal religious or humanistic value of charity, which he says is even higher. By accommodating the mystical and magical religiosity to the secular worldview, he becomes a chassid and yet not really a chassid at all. In essence, the Litvak has not actually moved at all from his original position. Rather, he's accommodated the Hasidic legend to his own values and his own worldview, which are not specifically Jewish, but reflect a kind of homogenized, Europeanized universality. So this Hasidic tale is actually about a chassid, but is not in essence Hasidic. And there's lots more examples of this in many of Peretz's different works, and if you want to see more examples, they're in the book. And Peretz's contemporaries and followers noticed this problem. He was at the center of the Yiddish literary scene. He was profoundly influential. Many people agreed with his argument about rejecting mimicry, but they critiqued his fiction for moving in the wrong direction. They noticed that it didn't pull it off. It was this realization that Peretz was right about his mission, but that even the master was incapable of pulling off the mission, that clarified for his critics what the next step in Jewish primitivism had to be. It had to be not just the idea of turning to the primitive of the folk for inspiration, but actually finding a way to make art that reflected that argument. Okay, so then the following chapters of my book show different examples of how that worked, but they all emerge from the central contradiction that there's a burning desire to make some Jewish art that isn't subject to Europeanness, that is special, that is distinctively Jewish, but it's hard to get away from that Europeanness because Ashkenazic Jews were European. They were living in Europe, working in a cultural world that was European. So what they were striving for was in some respects impossible to achieve. And that's that central paradox of primitivism. It's constantly pushing people. As I said, it's about a direction, but without being able to identify a goal. So now for just a few more minutes, I'm going to share with you from the last chapter of my book, some pictures, an example of a photographer who was working in a context that was broadly similar to the sort of shape of the literary context. In literature, there was Peretz at the sort of pinnacle. In art, there was someone even more famous than Peretz, Marc Chagall. This artist that I'm going to show you struggled, and I think actually managed to pull off emerging from that shadow of Chagall. But here's to start with, a kind of funny and cynical view of what Chagall meant to some of the contemporary artists who were trying to critique him. So in a 1923 article on the famous Soviet Jewish artist Else Lasker-Schüler, in the journal published in Berlin, Milgrim, and here's a picture by Lasker-Schüler from his early phase. The Jewish artist, Polish Jewish artist, Henryk Berlevi, dismissed the Jewish folk motifs that characterized Lasker-Schüler's early works. And here you can see an example on the right side, beside the Milgrim cover. And Berlevi wrote that Lasker-Schüler had moved on from that kind of Chagallism, right? So he calls it Chagallism. What was Chagallism exactly? Berlevi didn't really say, but he said it was sentimental and it was folkloric, Jewish folkloric. In a later article, Berlevi wrote that just 2 years earlier, right? So he's being snarky about Chagall, when just 2 years earlier, he himself and Lasker-Schüler were obsessed with the Dybbuk by Ansky. And he said that in Lisitsky's studio, the distant echo of the Dybbuk was echoing everywhere. All right, but the problem is that the Dybbuk is a great example of Chagalism, and you can even see it in Berlevi's own work. Here's a lovely lithograph by Berlevi from 1921 that depicts the two main characters of the Dybbuk, Hanan and Leah, in a style that is, it's distinct. It doesn't look exactly like Chagall, but it's clearly influenced by Chagall. 2 years later, Berlevi's already being snarky about it. So there's a sea change underway in art. But it doesn't mean that Chagalism had died out. Chagall's success was so great that most European Jewish artists had to at least try their hand at it. Lisitsky, Ber Ribak, Yankel Adler, Berlevi, lots of people were working, trying to do their own version of Chagall. But Chagall, unlike Peretz and the critique that Peretz prompted, Chagall didn't really prompt a similar critique in art. Aside from Berlevi and a couple of others, nobody really sort of used Chagall as a way to think through the next steps of Jewish art. Among photographers, the situation was arguably even more conservative. Two of the best known examples of this, of European Jewish photography, are Alter Katzizne and Roman Vishniak. Vishniak is of course very famous. And both can be said to have produced a kind of Chagalism in photography, but without any of Chagall's sort of modernist techniques or interests. This is very sentimental stuff here. Here's Katzizne, who was a writer, but also had a photographic studio. He was the correspondent for the Vorwärts, the photographic correspondent for the Vorwärts in the 20s. And here's a portrait. This is the synagogue beadle, the shamus, and this is the gulas punim that we see on his face. This is like the tragic reflection on the visage, on the face of the situation of European Jews. Roman Vishniak is quite similar. Here's one of his most famous photographs from the cover of his 1947 book, Polish Jews, and it's quite similar to Katzizne. It's intense, it's focused, but it's unspecific. There's a kind of purity catalyzed, the purity of focus catalyzed by religiosity and poverty. Modernity is going to ruin it all. It's only the old bearded Jews who are strong enough to confront it with open eyes. These are visual stereotypes about an idea of authentic Jewishness, an idea that remains to this day very appealing to many. A further issue with photography is that unlike art, a painting is clearly a painting, photography has this way of claiming, because of the way that the physical process of capturing the photograph works, there's an implicit claim that it shows an unvarnished reality. Vishniak famously capitalized on this implicit assumption about the reality of photography to present his works as documentary, even though so many of them were staged or posed, many of them. What would an alternative to this kind of Chagalism look like? What would a primitivism and a sort of aggressive critique of Chagall or of Vishniak look like in photography? Here's my answer. The 1931 photo book with the German title here, Ein Ghetto im Osten Vilna, a ghetto in the East Vilna, by Moshe Vorobeychik. Vorobeychik's approach is possibly unique. I can't think of any other examples that do quite the same thing as Vorobeychik in creating a visual kind of Jewish primitivism, which both reproduces to some extent that sentimentality, but also critiques it. Most of the other artists who critiqued Chagall gave up the idea that you could represent human beings at all and did kind of abstract, completely abstract works. In photography, that option was much more difficult. And in photography, you get Vorobeychik, who tries to do something a little different. Let's quickly look at what these different things are that he does. So first of all, this book is very interesting. It was published by a press, the Orel Füssli Verlag in Zurich, which still exists, and it was a popular press. It was meant to sell a lot of books, and it came in a series of photo books that had these kind of things like living free, photographs of like modern apartments, technical beauty, photographs of like airplanes and zeppelins. And these were like small format and relatively cheap. The book also had this kind of like almost National Geographic type of ethnographic 5 or 6 volumes in the series, doing this sort of prurient, exotic, titillating type of thing about so-called primitive peoples. And then there was Vorobeichik's book about the Jewish street of Vilna. Here you see the Yiddish title of the book, Yiddische Gas in Vilna, the Jewish street in Vilna. So this is a strange book, not only because of where it appeared in a popular book series printed in Zurich, but also because, unlike any of the other books in this book series, it was published in 3 bilingual editions, all together in 1931. The front and the back had different languages, and the book's pictures all had 2 captions. One was in German and Hebrew. So here's the, going back, here's the, oh, no, here's the, this is the Yiddish. Here's the Hebrew. Here's the German. Okay, and then there's an English cover. So the versions were German Hebrew, English Hebrew, German Yiddish. It's not entirely clear to me what the publishing house was thinking. In the archives, they still had his contract, but they didn't have their marketing plan, like what was going on with these multilingual editions. But clearly, the question that Vorobeichik is raising is no longer just about German Jews or Jews in the Russian Empire, the Pale of Settlement. This is now in 1931 a global phenomenon. The Ashkenazi diaspora is around the world in great numbers, speaking many languages, not just Yiddish. And this has become a sort of transnational question. So Vorobeichik uses this multilingualism to his advantage, not just randomly, and he has a real sense of humor about it. So you can see here in this picture, these multiple pictures of doors, right? You want to get into the Jewish area of Vilna, the doors are all closed, and which is the right one to go through? And it's a kind of funny thing. He's saying to the people who have this maybe prurient interest, oh, I want to look at the Jews the way I look at the, you know, the primitive Pacific Islanders or the African tribes. And Vorobeichik is saying, well, okay, but not quite yet, not so easy. You got to figure out which door you're coming through. On the other hand, that's the Yiddish cover. So he's saying that to Yiddish speakers. Here's the Hebrew title, which has the same one. He's saying the same thing to Hebrew speakers, Jews. Here's the German and English cover. The German and English cover shows a sort of more stereotypical view. There's a kind of dominating downward look, an only partly visible point of exit at the back. There's a crowded alley. But what is interesting there? Is it kind of at the vanishing point? Is it on the other side of the gate? What's the purpose of being here and looking at it? There's nothing immediately and obviously interesting. It's kind of a muddy, blurry, dark view, right? So to the German readers and to the English readers who are saying, oh, I want to see these interesting Jews, he's saying, well, maybe they're not as interesting as you think, right? Maybe they're just regular people. Vorobeichik also was doing something interesting because of the style of photography he did. Here's a picture not from his Vilna book, but from a book that he published in the same year, 1931, about Paris. He was working in Paris. He was originally from Vilna. He'd gone to Germany in the 1920s to study in the Bauhaus, cutting edge art. And then he had gone to Paris, which is where, you know, every artist with great aspirations goes. And here's a picture that shows this kind of extremely cutting edge technique that he did. It's a superimposed image of a schlepper pulling a hand cart, superimposed under or over automobiles. So, right, tradition, pre-industry, and then the automobile, modernity, the industrial world. And this became a relatively famous book. If you want to judge these things based on price, The Paris book, collectors could only buy nowadays maybe for $30,000. If you're lucky, you can still find the Vilna book for a few $100s. It also gives you a sign of the publishing house having published more of the Vilna book. But the Paris book was, a really strong statement of modern photographic techniques. But what was he doing making a Vilna book? Right, and here's another one from the Paris book. There's the Eiffel Tower with an apartment building beside it. Why the Vilna book? What's going on with the Vilna book? In the Vilna book, you would think if this were a critique of Vishniak, a critique of sentimental portrayals, then there would be a lot of that kind of automobile thing, but there isn't in the Vilna book. It's about a stereotypical view of the quote unquote shtetl. And so there's no automobiles. There's nothing modern at all. There's no steel. Oh, what happened here? There's no steel structures. There's no nothing at all that's modern that you see in the Paris book. Here's what you see. Here's an image in the Gaon synagogue in Gaon's Kleis. That's the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. It's a beautiful picture. It's an interesting picture, and it shows you the kind of playful thing that Vorobeichik is doing. And I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of these pictures and show you how Vorobeichik is playful. And it's in the playfulness that he's undermining that stereotyping and that sentimentality. Because there's a cute little pun here that you can't see in the German, which just says im Beit HaMidrash, im Lehrhaus. The Hebrew it's not a translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew says Zohar, which is a Hebrew word for brightness, but also the word for the central book of the Kabbalah. And you can see that brightness glowing off of the surfaces of the lecterns and of the benches. The lightness comes out of the furniture, not only out of the books, right? It should come out of the books as these centers of radiance, but it's also coming out of the lecterns. Okay, so the picture looks simple at first, but then in a subtle technical manipulation, emphasizing that brightness, he's playing a little game. Here's my favorite, and maybe this will be the last one that I show you so we can get to the Q&A. This is my favorite. On the caption says architecture and man, that's on the left with the exclamation point, and on the right, man and surroundings. So this is kind of very dry and documentary. You think something should be interesting in the pictures, but the pictures are or at least what's depicted in the pictures is as uninteresting as the surrounding. It's like a guy standing in some wet mud. Like, what is that about? That's on the right-hand side. But it's actually an elaborate visual pun, and I love this. The image on the right shows you this kind of like poor stereotype Jew smushed down by poverty, but also by the camera angle from overhead. The image on the left shows in the dot below the same picture, the same guy, but it's turned into an exclamation point. Okay, so the exclamation point becomes a kind of like almost sarcastic comment, right? This is not interesting. This is boring. This is just a guy standing in mud. Like, what's the exclamation about that? Why does that get an exclamation point? But there's another level of pun here, because it's a visual pun on the Yiddish phrase das Pintele Yid. Literally, that means the point of a Jew, das Pintele Yid. It idiomatically means the essence of a Jew. When you say das Pintele Yid, you mean the core, the essence of a Jew, what it means to be a Jew inside, which is an idiom that's already a play on words, because the Pintele Yud is the point on top of the letter Yud in Jewish ritual scribal writing. The Pintele Yud is the point on top of the Yud. When the letter Yud becomes Yid, the Jew, and if you speak Yiddish as I do with a non-Yivo, non-Litvish pronunciation, the Yud is already a Yid. The Yid is a Yid. Then this diacritic, this point on top of the Yud, becomes an expression of Jewish identity, right? So the exclamation point is the Pintele Yud, is the essence of the Jew. So Vorobeychuk has kind of very gracefully and wittily exposed the pun at the heart of this idiomatic phrase and showing the kind of stereotyped identity underlying that idea. The idea that there's an authentic, essential type of Jew is already contained in that idea, which is a Jewish idea to some extent of das Pintele Yid. It's an internal idea as well as an external idea. And then just very quickly to show you one last one, to show you, again, another example of the kind of almost sarcastic, but at the very least satiric type of thing that Vorobeychuk is doing. Here's a picture where he shows a very jumbled storefront. He's cut up pieces of a print of a shop, and he's glued it back together and printed it out, making it look like a complete and utter mess. And the caption says in Hebrew, Ashirim Amcha Yisrael, and then translated, your people Israel is rich, right? How rich are they really? There's a sarcastic comment going on here. The richness is to be found elsewhere, not economic richness. It's a different kind of richness. And yet, how much does that other type of richness really mean when the Jews there are mired in poverty? Okay, so he's kind of working with these sentimental stereotypes and saying, come on, right? This like authentic idea of the Jew, the holy poverty, the ennobling poverty. That's not how real life works, right? It might make a nice picture, but let's get real. There's nothing ennobling about poverty. And it feels pretty empty to say, even if it's a liturgical or biblical statement, that the people of Israel are rich, when actually they're extremely poor. So what's going on with Vorobeychuk's pictures is that even though some of them look like they're sentimental stereotypes, this blurring with the cutting edge modernist technique and with the satiric commentary of the captions creates a blurring that promotes and undermines the stereotyped image of the authentic Jew. But why didn't he take a more aggressively critical stand, like some of the people who critiqued Chagalism? Well, I think that Vorobeychuk didn't have the luxury of distance that such a critical position required. Distance both from his subjects and from the stakes of his work. I think Vorobeychuk, who was born in Vilna, the city that he depicts, speaking the same language, raised in the same religion as these people, I think ultimately he wanted to show that these Jews were human. His project was not only an aesthetic project, it was also a project about people. The Jews in his photographs weren't just tools for an artistic or an intellectual critique. He also wanted to emphasize that they were human subjects. These people had humanity. And if this meant introducing sentimentality, this was a price he was willing to pay because his task was urgent. The situation of Jews in Europe in the 1930s, nobody knew the extent of what would happen. But there were, bad stuff was happening aplenty. The situation was serious. The Jewish question was urgent for Vorobeychuk, as it was for Jewish writers and artists across the board. And it had an urgency that the human question or the ethnographic question or the question of folklore never had for the members of the avant-garde who more stridently promoted or critiqued primitivism and the system, the political system that underpinned it. Ultimately, for them, these remain problems of other people. But for Vorobeychuk, who immigrated to Palestine only a few years after these books came out in 1931, the question was much closer to home. The question demanded an engagement with people, not just as questions. So Vorobeychuk's bringing together of ethnographic and sentimental and avant-garde photography opens up the possibility that these subjects of the pictures have value originating outside the questions about Jewishness in art and about primitive art, or even about the legal and social status of the Jews in Europe. It's because Jewish primitivism had a different set of stakes than other forms of European primitivism. Vorobeychuk's book, A Ghetto in the East, is, like the other works of Jewish primitivism, not only about other people, it's personal. And that's what makes the story of Jewish primitivism ultimately so important to modern Jewish art. Thank you.
I believe people can unmute themselves now if they have a question to engage Professor Skinner with. I believe I'm allowing everybody to unmute themselves. Well, this is Jake Morowitz. Let me ask you a question. I mean, I didn't read your book. I'm getting my mind around your thesis.
Yeah.
But it seems that the writers and the artists that you're dealing with saw themselves rushing into modernity, into a different world, but were worried about it and worried about losing their Yiddishkeit.
Yep.
And as a result, turning back towards what you call the primitivism, the folklore, the superstition, as a way of expressing that angst about going in one direction and being afraid of losing back. Does that make sense to you at all?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, I got it.
Yeah, no, that means that I managed to say what I meant, and you were listening. So good for both of us.
Hi, I was wondering if you seem to indicate that when these people moved out of primitivism, which maybe was sort of nostalgic or something like that, either wit or something else supplanted it or became more authentic in its expression than a sort of a nostalgic thing on one hand, and definitely the wit of the photographer is great. I'm curious, did you see any examples of that in other forms of literature that were more authentic, or other forms of art or cinema or things like that that maybe you didn't have a chance to touch on in the lecture, that more authentic or that more real kind of transition?
Well, yes and no. So first of all, the question of more authentic, or what counts as more authentic or more primitive, is always shifting. It shifts with every artist or writer who kind of gives voice to it. And as we saw with Peretz, like within their own work, it's moving around all the time. So it's never quite clear enough. And I don't have a take on what's more authentic. For me personally, the question of authenticity is so deeply ingrained in this particular historical moment that it doesn't, personally work for me as a meaningful artistic category.
Sorry,
but for these writers,
if I could clarify for a second, I'm thinking like Sutzkever's poetry, which is sort of, and Chagall illustrated, and I don't exactly have the timing of it, but stuff that was sort of, mystical, or I don't want to diminish it at all. It's beautiful, modernistic, but versus stuff that might be slumming, if you will. I'm sorry, I hate to.
I mean, yeah. So lucky for me, Bear Levy gave me the word Chagallism. So I could just sort of ventriloquize through one of Chagall's contemporaries, this kind of critique. So interestingly, in art, basically, like I said, there's nothing quite like Vorobeychik. All the critics of Chagall basically move entirely away from representing Jews. And everybody who's left is just a kind of Chagall knockoff to one degree or another. In literature, there are a lot more alternatives presented to, let's say, Peretz in his kind of romanticism in a lot of different ways. One of the chapters of my book is about Der Nister. I think Der Nister presents a really complicated and interesting approach to primitivism that's quite distinct from Peretz. But you asked about wit. Is anybody funny? No, it's strange. Peretz is probably the funniest writer in my book.
But the Marx Brothers.
Well, they're not in the book. So the trajectory that I was tracking was not a trajectory of any kind of critique of European modernity, but of this specific critique of European modernity. So the Marx Brothers don't come in. Lots of people do come in. I don't talk about film. One could, for example, the Dybbuk film or Paul Wegener's Golem films from the late 19-teens in Berlin. And there are other examples of where film could come in. Music could come in. I'm not a musicologist. I limited myself mostly to literature and a little bit of visual art, in part because that's what I know best, but in part because I think that's where you see most strongly the dynamics of this question. And so something interesting that I don't really know the answer to is like, why in photography is the most notable alternative to Chagall also so funny? Whereas in literature, the starting point is funny and all of the critics are not. It's a good observation, and I don't really know.
Thank
Sam, could you show your book cover again? Somebody wanted to know the exact title. There you go. And
The
it's
title is Jewish Primitivism, published by Stanford University Press. And if you are so good as to buy it, do buy it from the Stanford website, and you can use a coupon code that they gave me, Spinner20. I'll put that in the chat box. Spinner20 will get you 20% off.
super. Are there any other questions or comments? I thought that this was fascinating. It really gives me a lot to think about. And I want to thank you very much. And be well. And Zayman Ali Gezind, I'm going to end our session on that note. Thank you again very much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to talk about my book. I appreciate it.
Thank you.